Well, I have to say, I am just really excited again for this, for our speakers, especially Atlas. Atlas 10 is amazing and has done some phenomenal work on our campus here at CSU. They work as an educator, a facilitator, a counselor, a spiritual care provider, and an individual you can connect with, hear from, is aware of who you are, has a master's of divinity from Naropa University. And you can take a look at this slide, of course, and see all that they have done. I want to share with you an experience that I had in attending one of Atlas's workshops on the pain that we had been encountering and some issues. And here we were in this big room, several people not knowing one another, looking at each other like, what did I get myself into? We thought we were just going to hear some kind of lecture. And yet, Atlas did amazing work with all of us in having us address issues, our pain, validating emotions. And by the end of our time together, there was such a new energy of healing. It was palpable. We are so blessed today to have Atlas Tan join us. Thank you so much, Atlas, for coming to our Social Justice Literacy for Teachers.
Thank you, Patricia. It's good to see you. It's good to see you, cont'd. It's good to see everyone. Let me adjust my view so that it's on gallery so I can see everyone. Cool. Wow. I'm so excited to be here. It's now 8:25 on my time. I am in Olympia, Washington, also known as Bushutwood, which is called Land of the Bears, and it's a trading site for many different tribes, including Nisqually, Squaxin, and Duwamish, etc. There's like 5-6 different tribes who do a lot of work here. And yeah, so it's 8:25. I want us to be more, to be sensitive on time. So cont'd, are we still ending at like I can't hear you, but it looks like you're saying whatever.
You got all morning, don't worry about it. Whatever time you finish is what you finish until lunch.
Okay, cool. I mean, lunch is very important and I want to respect lunchtime. So I'll do my best. Yeah, let what I share be like a confetti falling on you. Whatever sticks, whatever doesn't. And of course, I'm happy to talk about these things after our session too. This is something I'm very passionate about. So I am going to share my screen and show my slides. Okay, can people see? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So before we start, I want to share the menu of the day. This is sort of what I have to offer in our time together. I like to offer a menu of the day before I do anything because I am trying to center consent more in the way I offer things, information, my experiences. So this is what we'll be doing. And please feel free to like move in and out of this space as we are going through this. Understand like talking about healing, talking about liberation can bring up a lot. And it's important to listen to what our body is saying in the moment. If we need to dissociate, if we need to tune out, if we need to walk around, things like that, feel free to do that. It's more important to me that you show up in the way that we need to than to be fully present and participate. So we'll talk about housekeeping. We'll do some sitting and movement practice. And I would like to hear from all of you. So there will be some introductions. We'll talk about what healing justice is, and then contextualize it in a learning situation. And then I'll share a little bit about my thoughts and how I contextualize it. Take a break, and then we'll talk about some seeds of disruption, some ideas to look into or to keep exploring after the break. So yeah, centering consent in learning spaces. Because I am like facilitating the space, I have a lot of power, and it can seem like I make the rules, but I hope that we are all like free to move around and self-regulate and not sort of give in to this idea that we have to be like fully here and participate. So yeah, like I said, do what you need to do. Turn off your video if you have to. I will trust that we are doing our best to be present with ourselves and each other. And access needs, let's take like a few minutes to kind of check in with what we're needing from this time together. If there are any physical needs, mental needs, learning needs, what is your learning style? How can this session be accessible to you? I want to give room to that and give voice to things that I'm not aware of. I try to make what I do accessible and use the feedback I get from the past. But there's always more to be aware of, and I want to always make space for that. So some ideas that I came up with, I hope that you can see the whole slide because on my screen it's sort of cut off. So just let me know if it's not completely visible. So some of the examples I have learned from the past is some people are visual learners, some people are verbal processors, some people are internal processors, and some people are kinesthetic learners. I very much identify as the last one, tend to move around a lot, walk around, want to get up and like do things, and a lot of times it's very difficult. So to be aware of that, to be aware of my needs and be able to communicate that has helped me in the past. Like for me, it's like, I'm gonna be doodling. I may stretch a lot. I may just like move my legs a lot. Be aware of that. But in this context, it doesn't really matter because you're just seeing this part of me. So think about it as I'm talking. There will be moments to share your access needs during introduction. And before we do introduction, I would like us to take a minute and arrive and practice together. I come from a background, so having gone to Naropa, we always meditate before and after, and that's sort of a habit that has been useful for me to do whenever I'm facilitating spaces. Because we just did a quick transition from what cont'd was talking about, and there's probably a lot working in your body or in my body as I'm listening or as I was listening. So let's give us a few minutes to let that settle. I will guide us into some mindfulness practices that I have been doing for myself. So this is an invitation to either follow my practice or follow your own practice. Do what feels good for you, or to switch in and out, be fluid with it. We'll do some sitting practice and then we'll do some movement practice because for some people, moving around is more centering and grounding, and sitting around can be not helpful. So there are options. With sitting, find a position that feels good for you, that brings in alertness and dignity. I recommend trying not to lean back because for me that can make me feel very relaxed and sleepy sometimes. So I like to lean away from my chair and to feel like your base, whether sitting, whether laying down, whether standing, to feel it to be stable. Posture is so important because, yeah, where our body goes, our mind sort of follows. You may close your eyes or you may open your eyes and softly gaze in front of you. You can do whatever with your hands, up, open palm facing down. You can do your mudras if you have them. I like a simple hand on my thighs. And just settling into the gravity of our bodies on the chair or on whatever we are sitting or laying on. And just feeling our weight on the surface. And starting to tune into our breath and our breathing. And checking into our breathing. How am I breathing in this moment? Where can I find my breath? Do I find it on my chest? Or is it the feeling of my shirt rising and falling? Or is it the feeling of air coming in and out of my upper lip? What is the rate of my breathing? Is it fast or slow? What is the depth of my breathing? Is it deep or shallow? And we're just making observations here. There's no value being placed. This is how I'm breathing right now. You may practice deep breathing if you feel so inclined, but otherwise, just being aware sometimes it lets our body self-regulate. And as we tune into our breathing, we can expand that awareness to the rest of the body. How am I sitting right now? We can make small micro adjustments or let the body make its own adjustments. Sometimes, not everyone has a straight spine or a very stable posture or whatever, and our bodies will make small adjustments naturally in order to feel more settled. So allowing the body to move itself into feeling more grounded. And here I invite you to tune into a sensation of touch. It could be your hands, how your hands feel, or how your feet feels. Don't have to tune in to the whole skin of our body. It's a lot. And that can bring up a lot of intensity too. So just picking one thing and tuning into that. How does my hand feel, for example? What am I touching? What is the texture of it? And next, to tune into our sense of hearing. What am I hearing in the space that I am in? Again, not assigning values, no judging. Just simple taking note and observation of what this body is experiencing in this moment. Taste. What am I tasting in my mouth as I'm sitting here? Could be an aftertaste or no taste at all. Noted. Smell. What is the smell like in the space I'm in right now? As I tune into that, what is coming up in my body? And if your eyes are closed, I invite you to gently open them and use your sense of sight if accessible. and see what is in front of you. And just notice with like a loose focus, with a soft gaze. Notice colors, notice textures, notice depth, lighting. And feel free to look around your space and just notice the space that you're in. Could be the screen, could be what's around you. And if you would like, this is where I invite you to stand and practice aimless wandering, or you can continue sitting or laying down. So with aimless wandering, we're just standing and we're walking around the room aimlessly in ways that feel spontaneous and good to us. If we were outside, it's even better because then you can look at the rocks or flowers. But in the room, you know, kind of look at what is nourishing for you, I guess, and sort of allow yourself to gravitate towards that and say hi to them. This is also a good time to move in ways that feel good. It could be some small movements of your arms or your neck, or some stretching that you like to do. I recommend making sure that you stretch your sides daily and as often as possible if you're someone who sits around a lot, because the back pain is real, I feel like, as I get older. So giving yourself some space to do some light stretches before we continue to sit down and be still for the next few moments. Walking around, allowing some light movement. Shake things off, loosen up the muscles. A lot of emotions are stored in the muscles, in the body, and making sure that we shake it off once in a while. When I see my dog shake her body, I try to shake mine too, because it's a good reminder when she stretches. It's a good reminder. It's like, oh yeah, this thing is here and it's very stiff, this human body. And I need to constantly check in with it and move it, because a lot of how my life is designed is very much very sedentary, and that is not how my ancestors lived. And that's it. Thank you for doing that with me, and hopefully it helps you feel a little more present or grounded. And if not, that is okay. So can people still see the slides? Is that still happening? Okay, good. So who am I? What am I doing here? I want to introduce myself a bit. Like I said, my name is Atlas Tan. My Chinese name is Chen Jia Yi, and I use they them pronouns. I come from many different countries. This is the 4th country I've lived in. I've immigrated here in 2009 on my own for college. And before that, I was in Indonesia, China, and Singapore, so mostly Southeast Asia. English is my 3rd language, so forgive me if things don't make sense sometimes, because what is grammar anymore? I identify some of my salient identities. I identify as trans. I identify as non-binary and queer. I'm also neurodivergent. It took me a while to come to terms and to find language to communicate what it means to be neurodivergent. And for those who are not aware of what that means, it just means that I have different needs when it comes to my mental health and how I can access learning spaces or social spaces. It does also mean, for me in my context, that I'm autistic. Not all neurodivergent people are autistic. Everyone has different needs, but I'm coming from that point. And autism looks so different with everyone too, and it's like a whole can of worms. So I'll just stop there. With that, I also identify as a relationship anarchist, and what that means is I do practice non-monogamy in the broad sense, but really what it comes down to is that I spend a lot of time thinking and questioning, criticizing the way in which we love, relate, and form relationships and communities based on our dynamics and our trajectory and our intentions that we share together as people interacting with each other. That's also a lot to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to that. But that is where I'm at. There's also a lot of really cool resources on relationship anarchy online. If you Google it, you can go down into a rabbit hole easily. A little more about my background. So I do a lot in spiritual care. I started with, well, I went to grad school for business and I was in advertising. And then I realized that a lot of advertising is evangelism. And then I got really curious about evangelism. I'm like, what is it that we are selling here in this capitalistic world? We're selling ideas, we're selling thoughts. And what is that based on? It got me into the medical system. I worked as an EMT because I'm like, well, this seems meaningless. Let me do something else. And as I was working as an EMT, I realized there's a lot of things wrong with the way we view death, with the way we view life and what it means to keep someone alive. There's a lot of issues there, and that did not sit well with me. Physically being in the ambulance, physically being with someone who's dying, it was very difficult to not have the tools to be with that, because in the end of the day, it reflects on how I am with my own life and with my own process of dying. As a human being who's aging and who's like going through all these things. So that got me into the Master of Divinity program and got me into really thinking and redesigning the ways in which I participate in the process of like death and dying. And when you contemplate about your death, you start contemplating about your life and how you live and how you make decisions and how you choose to grow and learn. I am a Virgo, so I'm very mercurial. What it means is that I love knowledge. I love moving information and I love integrating them into my life and trying to make sure they align with my purpose and my reason of being here on this earth. So from having graduated grad school, I have been working. I wanted to work with prisoners and military people in the beginning, but that got me into all kinds of places as I dove into that. I started working with the elderly. I worked with people with Alzheimer's for a while. And then I somehow ended up in higher ed. I was the spiritual care resident at Colorado State. So basically I was the school chaplain. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen a queer trans person of color chaplain before, but here I am. I don't know how I ended up there, but it brought me to even more opportunities, meeting cont'd and other people. I started teaching more and sharing more about some of my insights and my 2 cents of how we can do things differently and we can do things better. A lot of it is from my own experience of how to make learning accessible for myself. I hope that what I share will be useful for you. And I acknowledge that I haven't been doing a lot of this as long as many of you probably have. So a lot of this comes from my own observation of my life and what it means to be someone who loves learning and wants to facilitate learning spaces. So from you, let's do this in the chat box since there's like 20 something of you. And while I would love to hear all your words, maybe someday we can have our own interaction. I love one-on-ones more than anything. But for now in the chat box, I would love to hear your name, your pronouns, and any access needs that I need to know of. And then what have you learned in the seminar so far? One sentence. And then what are you looking forward to learning here in our space together or in life in general? And how does this apply to your work? Holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence and to bring in collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression in our bodies, in our hearts, and in our minds. A lot of their mission is around building community and survivor-led responses rooted in Southern traditions of resiliency that sustain their emotional, physical, spiritual, psychic, and environmental well-being. This I got from the website. So what I got from, so the term healing justice is that it's a lot of connecting personal healing and social healing, but rooted in their culture, which is in the South. So as we throw this term around, I hope that we remember where this is coming from and the people who worked hard in collecting ideas and disseminating them, and to always honor that, because it can easily become an entire thing that is often, like, I feel like whenever a term comes up, can easily become whitewashed and diluted. So for me, it's always important to remember where it's coming from and how I'm using it from my context. So in the context of learning, there are some terms I want to unpack first. These are the words: knowledge, truth, wisdom, spirituality, and disruption. So the activity we're doing here is just take 3 minutes and journal. First thought, best thought. We're doing like association, word association or sentence association. What do these words mean to you right now before I share my definition? That way you have something to compare with later if you want to contemplate more on these terms. And if you're open to share them in the chat box. So I'm gonna stop sharing here and then open up the chat box and type in these words for you. Truth is that which is real to the perceiver, so feelings are true. Constructs, while ultimately not real, are very much real because they do impact people's lives in very significant ways. And wisdom is the quality of having been aware of one's knowledge, or the process of being aware of your knowledge. I see it as how we keep track and assess and observe our patterns of knowledge. So how this affects the way I learn and facilitate learning spaces is I try to center these definitions, and that how that shows up is like, am I feeling passion or interest in my body as I'm learning? Are the people I'm with feeling that? Like, what is the vibe in the room? Is it good? And how does it relate to what I know in the past? How does it connect to what I know to be true? And then what are some curiosities or movement I feel that are coming up, that are pulling me towards? What am I gravitating to as I'm learning, as I'm digesting this content? This is very spiritual approach to learning, because it invites me, it requires me to look into myself. And spirituality, in this case, I define as the connection to the self and anything else the self perceives. So that could be a higher power, it could be this iced coffee, it could be anything the self perceives. And that awareness of that relationship, that connection, that's spirituality. So when we do spiritual practices, we're enhancing and deepening our connection with that which we perceive and experience. Spirituality, in a way, is about being in that liminal space, being in that in-between space, and learning to be in that space, because there are times where it's very difficult to be in that space. So with that said, to talk about disruption, that's the definition from Google. It's what I use to contemplate. And I like to think about the word disrupt, as in like rupture, and imagining, visualizing the bursting and falling apart of things. I almost wrote a book on disruption. I think about it a lot. Disruption is inevitable. It will always happen, especially in the so-called natural world, or what I call the more than human world. Disruption always occur, or what we see as disruption, right? But naturally, it's actually just the dynamic process of life unfurling. So it's something that's inevitable. And what does it mean, right? To be seen as disruptive as a child, like I'm constantly told that I'm not behaving, I'm not doing what I need to do, to be a good student, a good child, or whatever. And then as an adult, what does it mean to choose to embody disruption because of my identities and my actions and the way I choose to act? They're very disruptive. And what does it mean to own that? So these are some points of contemplation for us to take home. We all have disruptive qualities as messy human beings. I think that is always there. And how do we use that as a tool, as medicine, as weapons in the way we dismantle and redesign ways of living, learning, and being? What I like about embodying and embracing disruption is how it promotes complexity. A lot of how I was trained, I was taught, is very opposite from embracing complexity. Like in Sesame Street, you're taught to look at what is the same, what is different, to always rule out what is different, and to see it as like something as undesirable. So what does it mean to retrain myself to, in my nervous system, to embrace complexity and to complicate whatever it is that I encounter, because there's always so many sides to it and so many ways of looking at it. And as I, meditate on disruption and embracing disruption, my disruptive qualities, I have found that I'm able to be with complexity more. And complexity is important because there are multiple truths, because we are humans and we make meaning, and meanings are always very complicated and contextualized in experiences which are related to identities, to social, political conditions, to our own generational, intergenerational trauma. It's all connected to, it's interdependent to everything around us. So to be able to find a way to rest and be okay with complexity and disruption, it really goes a long way. I'm gonna pause here. Are there any comments or questions that people want to share before I keep going? Feel free to just like live chat alongside, because that is helpful for me too, to see like, yeah, how is everyone doing? So wait, if I stop share, then I can see the chat box. Oh, I just saw cont'd's comment about embracing complexity. It's a way to honor the life process because we live complexity. The culture of the US moves us through simplification, unless you're in the sciences, but even their complexity in the modern human world is compartmentalized. There's just so much to talk about this, and I have like 5 minutes until break, but embracing complexity really also translates to how we hold conflict, right? Because that's when it really grinds on us, like, oh, that is when the nerves are tested, and that's where our training is going to show how do you sit with complexity when it actually hurts, when it actually brings a lot of intensity for you. How do you then design structures based on that complexity, based on the tension you've gone through? How do you redesign, or just design and generate different ways of being and relating to each other? I really think that's how society should be built, or rules should be set, just based on how we go through complexity together and how we show up. Embracing complexity also gives us the opportunity to consider ourselves, all the varying facets, and have compassion for ourselves. Yes, yeah, compassion for ourselves. Like, of course, I am this way. It makes sense because of what I have gone through. Okay, I'm gonna go back to sharing screen. So this is a little summary of what I just said. If you want, you don't have to screenshot it because I'm gonna send you the slides. Oh yeah, this is a 15 minutes break. I am in good timing. So 3 more minutes before we move on to the seeds of disruption and looking more of like the practical ways of applying this thought. There's 2 more chats coming up. Disruption feels like empowerment to me. Yes, 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 yes. We have been talking about regulation, polyvagal, co-regulation, the way we hold conflict, disruption, dissent becomes more viable endeavor when we have tools that allow us to work. Yeah, to look at different tools in working with conflict and disruption and dissent. That's when we really like, so there's, you know, the 3 phases of group formation, the storming, forming, and deforming, performing. I like deforming, but I think a lot of how we grow with each other as a community, whether learners or whatever, is through how we move with disruption. The black, white, right, wrong one way, the other worldview is the most pervasive way that our minds have been colonized by the state. Yeah, yeah. The dualistic binary way of thinking has got to go. Things are complicated. And the more we can see that in everything we go through, especially where we have resistance, the more we can feel, the more I can feel love and compassion. Like once I understand something, I can't help but love it for what it is. Any questions or curiosities that you want to name? In our last minute before break, does Karidad want to add anything more? Because I know you and I, we talk about this a lot.
You're so funny. I was gonna.
Is the improvisational approach used by this professor. Her name is Michelle Haidt. She teaches English at Spelman College. She wrote this article called On the Edge of a Bank, Contemplating Other Models by Which to Live. And in that model, she talks about using jazz improv as a way to visualize how class content is designed. And then lastly, this is sort of my own thoughts, like how to create more introvert-centered learning spaces. Or even just socializing spaces if I'm hosting friends or whatever. How do I make it more introvert friendly? Because introverts our experiences and voices are very marginalized in a society that promotes extroversion and rewards extroversion as a behavior. Again, I will send you the slides, so no need to copy everything word per word. But you know, if you want to, do what feels good. So critical consciousness by Freire. This is a concept that he writes a lot about, and it's basically developing the ability to recognize, analyze systems of inequality and a commitment to take actions against these systems. So it's a lot in my experience of looking at power dynamics. And how I teach, it often looks like questioning student-teacher dynamic with my students, talk about what does it mean to have this relationship that we have here, and acknowledging that as quote unquote teacher, I have a lot of power that I'm granted and some of them are not fair to you. And how do we constantly question that as it comes up and unpack it and complicate it? How do we remove the hierarchy that comes from the teacher-student dynamic? Because teachers are learners and students are teachers. In that sense, there is no hierarchy except what the institution has placed onto me. And how do I, while existing in that institution, while still carrying a lot of the oppressive structures, how do I do my best to question that in the way I use my language and in the way I hand out assignments, grade, teach, all these things, every action, every breath, how do I constantly challenge that in my best ability? And going from there, I like to extend it to students' experiences with institutional power, because power is very obvious there. So starting with how they relate to the school system, with their family, with healthcare, with government. But then in the end, there's also conversations around relationships, relationships to objects, to people, to the more than human world. There's power in everything that involves relationship. And how do we bring room to talk about that using the subject and content that we're learning in class? We can talk about oppression through math. There's a lot of things that can be talked. Chemistry is alchemy. So there is ways to like talk about how to dismantle power and oppression with any learning content, I believe, because it has to. it has to be talked about, and it has to be talked about through the students' experiences and integrated so that they can use it immediately. You can definitely, I think I love math, but you can definitely use math to work towards liberation. Okay, so with critical consciousness, they talk about 3 steps usually, or 3 things that you need to have critical consciousness. And that's the language of inequality, which I think everyone has been thinking about in the past few days. Interpersonally, institutionally, and I add intrapersonally within yourself. How do you make sense of how you relate to inequality? What kind of languages do you use with yourself as you're journaling, contemplating? How are you building awarenesses of the way you relate with these ideas? And then having spaces to interrogate racism, spaces that feel safe, that could look like caucusing, so dividing students into different identities, sometimes mixing the identities, like if you're a BIPOC or a person of global majority and you're queer, or if you're white and you have a disability. So like making sure that there's always like movement in the caucusing is super important. For me, those spaces are very, very important, because that's where accountability can be talked about safely. Because oftentimes when we call out someone or call in someone as someone who's been hurt, we get gaslighted, we get blamed, and that can be really painful for someone who's still recovering from the harm to like defend themselves, to make sure that they, are communicating what needs to be held accountable for. So it helps to have caucusing in class, because then you have other students who could support that student in voicing their needs and concerns. Because a lot of the harm we experience is identity based. It could look like, someone said something bad, and then those identities will affect what they say and how it impacts the person who is receiving that. Contemplative practices are spaces that we can have on our own, but also with each other. In that case, it looks like collective care. So how are we holding ourselves accountable as facilitators of learning in our own practices, and how are we sharing that with the students? Does it feel prescriptive? Is it authentic? Do they connect with it? Making sure there are spaces to constantly check in on that. That cat is so cute. Oh my God. I just love cats so much. Thank you, Cat, for coming. And collective care is an expression of contemplative practices done in community. I think it all comes down to care and how we show up to care for each other in ways that are, we're aware of how, like it's okay to cause harm. It's okay to like be violent sometimes, because we're human beings, and how are you holding that? How are you caring for that too? So yeah, okay, spaces to interrogate racism is important. And then lastly, taking action. This is what everyone, especially the students I work with, are very excited about, but really that has to come out later. And what does that look like individually? I think to talk about taking action, we have to talk about ethics. We have to like talk about all these other things that are based on how we are looking at inequality and how are we interrogating oppressive systems. The action has to come from the ground and the path of the process. And what does it look like short term, every day? As a learner, like what are the actions you're taking in reflecting and making sure that what you're learning is true to you? And what are you doing to like throw away what isn't useful? How are you going through your own birth, rebirth, and transformation in learning the subject? And then long term, what does that look like for you? I see long-term action as the practice of developing prophetic vision and prophetic voice. And I use that coming from a Christian term of being a prophet, which means how am I training myself to see the future that makes sense to me and to build the future that makes sense to me? That requires a lot of the ability to daydream and to be imaginative and to be creative. So taking action can also look like, how are we creating and making sure that we preserve those energies to create and make as human beings who express a lot and have a need to express. Any questions here before I move on to the next seed of disruption? I'm gonna stop sharing here. Question, thoughts, comments, reflections. Oh wow, there's 7 chats here. 9. Coming soon, disciplines. What is this list?
That was a bad copy paste. I was trying to get the title of the book. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, Kaida, thank you for sharing all those books. Anything Freire makes. I mean, he just recently, I think, not recently, but later released Pedagogy of Hope, which is an addition to Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So that's also a good book to get if you're getting Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then something about cultural work. He has a book on being a cultural worker, which I really love. Okay, so good on no questions, comments. I'm gonna keep moving on. So the next thing is land as pedagogy. As we build relationships with ourselves, as we develop spiritual practices that better connect us with ourselves, we connect with our body. And as we connect with our bodies, we can't help but connect with the land we're on because our body is consuming things from the land. So my question is like, how do we as settlers work with the land as we develop our pedagogy? How do we develop ways of learning that are connected to the land we're on as someone who is here, who is maybe displaced, who is coming from a lineage of colonizers, like all these things? How do we connect that in our hearts and minds? I feel this deeply the more I do my practice as someone who is raised away from the natural world. We didn't go camping, we didn't go hiking. I don't know how to build a fire. I wash my hands when it gets dirty, things like that. It took a while to find my own relationship and connection with the land. And I'll say that I do this a lot through my gut. Like my gut is very loud. It tells me what it needs, what I'm allergic to, what I love. And that is how I connect with the land, is I do it through food and my relationship with food. It has gotten me to hunting, to farming, to tracking, stealth work, all these other practices that allow me to be outside more and have a direct relationship with the land. And then how do I learn on the land? Because in the classroom, I feel like I'm going crazy. Like the walls are so white, the angles are so sharp. Like being outside, I feel like I'm more sane and my nervous system is more grounded and I'm able to learn better. And as a kinesthetic learner, being able to feel the dirt on my feet, being able to touch things, that really like boosts my passion in learning. And I know a lot of people feel that way too. So then like, how do we add that in the way we teach? Even just like bringing a potted plant to class sometimes makes a huge difference, or brings like gemstones where people can play with and talk about themselves. So how do we involve the land in our pedagogy and center it, hopefully, eventually, in how we teach? So in that book, as we have always done, and in other articles, so Leanne Simpson, she's writing a lot from the perspective of being Indigenous. And she's writing a lot on what it means to practice radical resurgence. These are terms that she coined. And it's about reclaiming the land as a way of learning for them as Indigenous people. So then as I read this, I have to sort of add an additional lens of like reflexivity on like, what does it mean for me to witness this as someone who's a settler, as someone coming from imperialistic backgrounds? Chinese people are highly imperialistic and patriarchal. What does it mean for me to relate that? I want to have these conversations and I haven't been able to find spaces to do that. So this is sort of my call in to, if you want to think about these things, talk with me about it. I would love to start some kind of Google Doc or some kind of snail mail, snail texting about these conversations. I want us to like make meaning on what it means to be settlers and to heal with the land, because we have to. and because there is not a lot of time, and because, yeah, literally lives are being at stake for these things. Okay, room for questions, comments, reflections on this. So there's a few chats here. On every break, I go water something in the garden, tie up a tomato. I always thought of gardening as a spiritual practice. It totally is. It totally is. It's about cultivation. I think about how plants unfurl themselves. Like the process of unfurling is so fun to think about. There's no forcing an unfurling. There's no speeding up or slowing down. It's in its own pace. And the more I can be with that, the more I can be with the unfurling of my own reality. There's just so many things to learn. Caridad. Yeah, food is my #1 love language. So naturally it became, and also, you know, like you grow up with food, right? There's so much tied to it. How your mother treats you, like your family dynamics, where the food comes from, how you grow it, how you want to grow it, how your relationship to like your future with food. There's so a cultural context. My God, yeah. There's a lot to talk about with food.
So I come in on the comment, just a lot of times when people, when we start to talk about land pedagogy, and of course, for some people, this is new. I think that people think that you have to do the kinds of things that Colorado is famous for, like hiking, etc. But there are all these ways in which we can connect to land. And actually, Atlas, we started with, I did the land acknowledgement, and then I did a little practice that I do about acknowledging the land from your perspective in terms of what land you're connected to, right? And as a way to think about that, but there's so many different ways to connect to land that we don't think about, right? There's even just stepping out and putting your feet out on the grass, walking barefoot, right? On grass in front of your house is a way to connect to land. And the idea that, it gives you all of these things, and that we're bringing that in. But I wanted to say too, there's this research that's demonstrating that when children are outside, that it increases gender equity. Just for y'all, and I'll find you a source on that. I have a source on that. So,
your immunity in general, your sanity, your attitude. I mean, it's just so good. Just touch the dirt, like just literally touch it, or stick your head out of the window. Like there's just so much direct transmission we get just from being outside. It doesn't require a backpacking trip. Or engaging with the elements, pouring water. So ritual is a way to engage with the elements. Burying something, smoking, fire, any elements. I feel like that counts too, even if you can't be outside, because not everyone can go outside. Okay. I will share a lot of my goals right now is around this. I am really interested in land-based learning because being in higher education and being academic world is killing me slowly. And I want to imagine better ways to thrive and better ways to learn that expands and excites me. And I have time and energy for it because I'm still young. I have a few decades and I can waste that by making mistakes and experimenting. So I invite those who are interested in reimagining higher learning that are, decentralized, that are spontaneous, that are community-centered, to talk with me about that. I'm happy to share with you some of the experiments I've done in the past. One of which was I started a queer fight club. It was a way to contemplate and reflect on our relationship to force and violence within ourselves, and then finding strength and voice in our movement and our bodies as people with marginalized identities. And to center kinesthetic learning. Like roughhousing is so fun. We don't get to learn through roughhousing. Why don't we do that? Because there's a lot of things, right? There's a lot of parameters that needs to be set up in order for it to be safe. So blah, blah, blah. Those are some of my thoughts. Let's see, so we're at 51. We have 9 more minutes. Okay, real quick, I wanted to do a practice together with you. It's called Lectio Divina. Has anyone heard of this? Trigger warning, it's Christian for those who are healing from religious trauma, I want to be sensitive to that, because I know sometimes if I hear about Christianity, it can be like, ooh, okay, feeling a little hot and sweaty here, need to breathe. Because that was intense growing up Christian. So Lectio Divina is a practice that I learned from contemplative Catholicism. Thomas Merton is a really good person if you are curious about contemplative Catholicism. Yeah. And Dorothy Day too. She started this soup kitchen and she's amazing. So there are good Catholics out there. That's what I learned as I get older. Someone who is so averse to Christianity. Lectio Divina means divine reading. It's a meditation practice that is very useful in reading and consuming any text, really in general. So I hope I can share that with you in a way that is fair to this practice in the few minutes we have left. So let's take like 3 minutes, I guess, to do this. It involves reading the thing, and then practicing meditation, which in this case, it means don't assign any meaning. Enter peace, enter equanimity, put yourself in a open space, however you practice that. You could imagine things, you could, tune into your breathing. And in that process, do some pondering, some light, gentle weighing and considering from various angles. I like to use the reference point of how does this content help liberate me? Like what is your point of what I'm reading here? And then to practice prayer, which in this case does not mean pray to God. It means practicing an earnest hope or wish. There's something in the practice of like just even thinking about prayer that trains our brain to look at certain things certain ways, which like affects our action and the trajectory of our behavior and the volition of our attitude. So I think practicing prayer is a beautiful thing that you don't have to be religious or Christian to do. It could be a wish for freedom, it could be a wish for kindness, compassion, safety, all these things. And then lastly, it's practicing contemplation, which is really just about observing, being with, and reflecting. Our mind, from what I know, is like a clear lake. That's how I like to picture it. It will reflect back what it is being put in front of. I don't need to do a lot of thinking to know what my mind is doing. I just have to observe it and see how the ripples form or what fish is jumping up, which I see as thoughts. So the text that we'll use today is an excerpt from that book, from this book, As We Have Always Done. It's from page 23 of the book. I put the citation on the bottom. I will read it with you and then I'll guide us through the whole process. So feel free to turn your video off or whatever you need to get comfortable. I will read it now. Living is a creative act with self-determined making or producing at its core. Colonized life is so intensely about consumption that the idea of making is reserved for artists at best and hobbies at worst. Making is not seen as a material basis for experiencing and influencing the world. Yet, Nishnabeg life didn't rely on institutionality to hold the structure of life. We relied upon process that created networked relationship. Our intelligence system is a series of interconnected and overlapping algorithms. Stories, ceremonies, and the land itself are procedures for solving the problems of life. Networked because the modes of our communication and interaction between beings occur in complex, nonlinear forms. Across time and space, there is necessarily substantial overlap in networked responsibilities, such that the loss of a component of the network can self-correct and rebalance. So we'll just let those words sink into us. I like to imagine like the visualization of rocks going into water and just like falling with gravity into the bottom of the water. And in our meditation, we try our best to enter this idea of peace, which really, for me, it's about equanimity. Equanimity is seeing experiences as neutral. We put values onto them, but in the end, they start as neutral. So we can do this by tuning into our breathing or tuning into sensations of the body and just observing them. You're free to continue to go back to the reading, or you're free to just sit there with yourself and just be with your thoughts. Everyone processes differently. But this is a good time to connect with the reading from our own location. How did it feel to read that? What are the feelings that came up for me? Sadness, excitement, anger. Can I name it? And if I cannot, is there a color to the feeling? Is there a shape to the feeling? Can I draw it in my head or on paper? Maybe a texture, maybe a dance movement or a movement that is a reaction to these readings. Is there a gesture? How does this reading connect with what I know? What is my breathing like as I'm going through all these processes? Do I notice my breathing speeding up, slowing down? And next we connect with this idea of prayer. What do I wish for? What are some of my intentions that I'm setting forth after this moment? First thought, best thought, whatever comes up. We don't have to churn hard. Could be nothing for now, and that's okay. We need stillness sometimes to come to clarity. This is a good, when doing prayer, I think it's really good to like put a hand on your heart or something, because it helps me connect with my body and what I truly wish for. The gut is another place to put your hand on, because the gut is usually a place that tells us what really matters. Could also be a direct nonverbal experience. Could be a breath. Prayer looks like so many things. And lastly, practicing contemplation. Just sitting here and observing all the things that has arisen, that is arising. This is a good time to journal if you're someone who likes to journal. Or you can just sit and just observe. Whatever is important will come back later if it's important enough. So there's really no need to grasp. And then slowly and gently come back to the room. If I could, I would do this for like 20, 30 minutes because that gives more room and space. But here's a taste of it, a sample of the practice. You can try this tonight before bed. If you are someone who reads a lot before bed, I feel like that's a really good time to practice Lectio Divina. Okay, so I know we're at time and I only have like one slide left. So I'm gonna go through it real quick because I really love this paper. The paper is more complicated than what I'm sharing. I'm just sharing one part of the paper. But basically, this professor, she taught a class that was inspired by the idea of jazz improv. If a class and the process of teaching is like music, and the students are part of the band, and they also have instruments to bring in and music to contribute to this space that we call a class, what would that look like? So she did no syllabus. The syllabus will emerge throughout time, and it is very much centered on the interest of students. So for those who are like me, like I need an outline, I need to plan out my time, it can be very anxiety inducing, but it's also an invitation to practice stepping into the unknown because life does not have a syllabus for you. And if you know how to center your interest and your passion, you know how to design your own syllabus in a way. And in a class together, then you would know how to meet your teacher or whoever in between. So a lot of her assignment is like no pages to read. You have your book, flip through it, find a part that's interesting to you and read that and bring to class for discussion. So like what makes your heart race and follow that. And then what are you curious about? Then we'll design a syllabus based on those curiosities. It makes it like, yeah, like the students are contributing music to this idea of like class. As long as you show up, you get credit. Showing up does not mean being physically there, but it also means being spiritually there. And sometimes you are not present in class because you're dealing with a lot of stress from home. So showing up can mean sharing some of those things. And as facilitators, to give space to those things, like what helps you be, what would you like to share that would help you be present right now because you seem distracted? And then hold that, not solve their problems, but hold that. It's like I acknowledge that you're going through a lot at home and that you cannot be present, and it's okay to do your best. And we'll talk about it after or whatever. And then centering quiet as principle. So this is coming from the book, The Sovereignty of Quiet by Kevin Quashie. It's a really amazing book. It's about what it means to gain sovereignty in quiet spaces as Black people. And it talks a lot about what it means to reclaim contemplative living and this idea of quiet living as people with like very, with marginalized identities. For me, that's how I contemplate it. I think I have notes about that somewhere. Yeah, but that book is about finding spaces to express from within, finding ways to be in the interior landscapes of our being and how that relates politically. So